All right, welcome to our deep dive revision explainer, designed specifically to get you ready for your AQA AS psychology exams. We're going to be breaking down two huge topics, the behavioral approach to phobias and the cognitive approach to depression. We'll cover the core theories, the therapies that came from them, and most importantly, the critical evaluation points. You'll need to really hit those top marks.
Okay, so here's our game plan. First, we're tackling phobias. We'll unpack the behavioral explanation, really pull it apart to evaluate it, and then look at the treatments. After that, we're going to use that exact same structure for depression, but from the cognitive perspective. Let's get right into it.
Right, first up, phobias. You have to be super precise here for your exam. These next few slides are all about locking in those essential A01 description marks. That means being clear, being detailed, and being accurate. So this core definition is absolutely crucial. A phobia isn't just, being scared of something. The keywords you've got to use are irrational, persistent, and out of all proportion. What's really interesting is that the person suffering often knows their fear is excessive, but they feel completely powerless against the anxiety it causes. Now, a fantastic way to structure a longer answer is to break it down like this. So emotionally, we're talking about that intense, overwhelming fear and anxiety. Behaviorally, the absolute key is avoidance. Someone with a phobia will literally rearrange their life to avoid encountering their phobic stimulus. And cognitively, like we just said, there's often this self-awareness that the fear is irrational, but that thought alone does nothing to calm them down. To really show the examiner you've got this, you need to know the difference between the main types. Specific phobias are what we usually think of, spiders, heights, flying. Social phobias, which we now often call social anxiety disorder, are all about fear in social situations. And then there's agoraphobia, which is often misunderstood. It's not simply a fear of open spaces. It's a fear of being in a situation where you feel trapped or can't escape easily, which often leads to people becoming completely housebound. Okay, now we get to the main event for the behavioral approach, the explanation. The two-process model is the absolute key theory you need to know. It's actually pretty elegant. One process explains how the phobia gets started, and the second process explains why it just won't go away. And this slide illustrates that first stage perfectly, acquisition through classical conditioning. The classic example you absolutely have to know is Watson and Rayner's 1920 study with little Albert. Okay, so at the start, Albert wasn't scared of a white rat. It was a neutral stimulus. But they started pairing the rat with a terrifyingly loud noise, an unconditioned stimulus that naturally creates fear, the unconditioned response. After doing this a few times, Albert learned to associate the rat with that feeling of fear. The rat had become a conditioned stimulus, and now it produced a conditioned response of fear all by itself. His fear even generalized to other white furry things. So why doesn't the fear just fade away? That's where the second process comes in, operant conditioning. It's all about maintenance. Think about it. When someone with a phobia avoids the thing they're scared of, say they leave a room to avoid a spider, their horrible feeling of anxiety immediately drops. The removal of that bad feeling is called negative reinforcement. It feels good, it's a relief. So that behavior, avoidance, is rewarded and strengthened, making them way more likely to do it again next time. It stops them from ever learning that the spider, or whatever it is, isn't actually going to hurt them. Okay, now for the bit that really separates the good answers from the truly great ones, the evaluation. To bag those top AOFRIN marks, you have to be able to weigh up the pros and cons of this two-process model. A solid evaluation needs balance. On the one hand, a huge strength is its real-world application. It led directly to effective therapies like systematic desensitization, and it gives a really convincing reason for why phobias stick around. But it has some big weaknesses. A key study by DiNardo and his colleagues found that not everyone with a dog phobia could even remember a bad experience with a dog. Plus, they found a bunch of people who had had a scary experience with a dog but didn't develop a phobia. This really suggests that there have to be other factors at play, like our thought processes, which the behavioral model pretty much ignores. And this is a really powerful counterargument. I mean, think about it. The two-process model doesn't really explain why we so easily develop phobias of things that were threats way back in our evolutionary past, like snakes, spiders, heights, the dark. But we rarely get phobias of things that are much more dangerous today, like cars or guns. Seligman's theory of biological preparedness argues that we're basically hardwired to learn these ancient fears very, very quickly. It's a concept the two-process model just can't account for. So, the logical next step after explaining a disorder is, of course, treating it. The behavioral approach gives us two key therapies that are all about breaking that cycle of fear and avoidance. Let's lay them out and then see how effective they really are. First up, we have systematic desensitization, or SD. This is a gradual therapy, and it's built on a principle called reciprocal inhibition, which is just a fancy way of saying you can't be deeply relaxed and terrified at the exact same time. So first, the client learns relaxation techniques. Then, they work with their therapist to create a fear hierarchy, starting with something that's only a little scary, like looking at a picture of a spider, all the way up to holding one. Finally, they slowly, step by step, work through that hierarchy, making sure they're totally relaxed at each stage before moving on. The idea is to replace the fear with relaxation. And then we have the complete opposite, flooding. There is absolutely nothing gradual about this one. It's all about immediate, intense, and inescapable exposure to the phobic stimulus. So someone with a fear of clowns might be put in a room full of them and not be able to leave. The theory behind this is that your body's panic response, all that adrenaline, can't last forever. Eventually, your body calms down, and in that moment, you learn that the thing you were so scared of is actually harmless. The fear response is extinguished. Now, when you're evaluating these in an exam, comparison is everything. The big trade-off is basically trauma versus speed. SD is much slower, and because it takes more sessions, it's often more expensive, but it's way less traumatic, so people are much more likely to see it through. Flooding, on the other hand, is fast and cheap, but it can be an incredibly stressful, even terrifying experience. This means it has higher dropout rates, and it's definitely not safe for patients with certain health problems, like a weak heart, because of the massive anxiety it produces. Both can work for specific phobias, but for more complex things like social phobia, you might need a different approach. Okay, let's switch gears completely. We're moving from behavior to cognition and from phobias to a very different kind of disorder, depression. And just like before, we're going to start by building a solid foundation with those essential AO1 descriptive points. For your exams, it's so important to be clear that clinical depression is not the same as the everyday low mood or sadness we all feel sometimes. We're talking about what the DSM calls major depressive disorder. This is a condition defined by a persistent low mood and, this is key, a loss of interest or pleasure in things you used to enjoy. It's prolonged, it's severe, and it significantly gets in the way of a person's ability to just live their daily life. So, our first key cognitive explanation comes from Aaron Beck. This diagram neatly sums up his idea that depression is fundamentally rooted in faulty, negative thinking patterns. He called this the negative triad. It's made up of three things. First, a negative view of yourself, thinking, I am worthless. Second, a negative view of the world. Nothing good ever happens. And third, a negative view of the future. Things will never get better. Beck believed these negative frameworks, or schemas, often develop in childhood and then get triggered by stressful life events later on, causing the person to see everything through this dark, pessimistic filter. Now, Albert Ellis adds another really interesting layer with his ABC model. He argued that it's not the events in our lives that make us depressed, it's the way we think about them. So A is the activating event, let's say failing a test. C is the consequence, feeling depressed. Ellis said that A does not directly cause C. The crucial link is B, the belief about the event. A rational belief might be, oh, well, I didn't study enough, I'll try harder next time. But an irrational belief, like I'm a total failure and I'm going to fail at everything, that's what leads to the depressive consequence. So we have these two really influential cognitive models from Beck and Ellis. But the big question is, how well do they actually explain depression? It's time to turn to that crucial AO3 evaluation. This right here is the critical question you have to tackle in any evaluation of the cognitive approach. Look, there's tons of evidence showing that people with depression do have more negative and irrational thoughts, no doubt about it. But the problem is, which comes first? Does the faulty thinking cause the depression, or does being depressed cause the faulty thinking? It's a classic chicken and egg problem. There's no clear evidence that the negative thinking always precedes the depression, and that's a really significant limitation of the explanation. So, just like the behavioral approach led to behavioral therapies, these cognitive theories gave rise to one of the most widely used therapies in the entire world today, cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. CBT is basically a direct application of what Beck and Ellis were talking about. The cognitive part is all about working with a therapist to pinpoint and challenge those irrational thoughts and negative schemas. The behavioral part involves encouraging the client to get out and do more rewarding activities, a process sometimes called behavioral activation. The whole point is to break that vicious cycle where negative thoughts lead you to do nothing, which then just confirms your negative thoughts. And when it comes to how well it works, the data is pretty powerful, and you should definitely know a key study for your exam. Keller and his colleagues back in 2000 looked at recovery rates for depression. They found that antidepressant drugs alone had a 55% recovery rate. CBT alone was very similar at 52%. But, and this is the really interesting part on this slide, look at that third bar. When they combined drugs and CBT, the recovery rate shot up to a massive 85%. This is really strong evidence that an integrated approach, tackling both the biology and the cognition, is the most effective way to go.
So the crucial thing when evaluating CBT is to be nuanced. Yes, it's highly effective and flexible. That's a massive strength, but it's not some kind of magic bullet. Research by Koikin and Sivakos showed that how good the therapist is plays a huge role in whether the patient gets better. And on top of that, as Simon and his colleagues found, CBT might not work as well for people who have really rigid mindsets, are resistant to change, or whose depression is coming from really difficult life problems that therapy can't just wish away. The patient has to be motivated.
So as we wrap up this revision explainer, this is really the central question to think about. We've looked at two powerful but very different ways of understanding mental illness. The behavioral approach sees us as being shaped by our environment and what we learn. The cognitive approach puts all the emphasis on our internal world, on our thoughts. Being able to compare, contrast, and critically evaluate these different perspectives is absolutely essential for your exam success. Good luck with your revision.